Now, in the last lesson, we tackled how our server should respond when a client tries to make a GET request on our articles route when they want to fetch all of the articles. And we've configured our server to be able to handle that, to fetch all of the articles in our database. Now, the next one to tackle is what happens when a client makes a post request to our articles route that should create a new article and add it to our collection in our database. Now, here's a tricky one because the client now is going to send data essentially to our server. And at the moment, we don't really have a front end, right? We don't have a web form, for example. Hit submit and it sends the data by making a post request to this route. Without creating all of that front end and creating the HTML and designing it up, how can we keep it pure and just build our API without the need for building the front end? Well, we know we have our server that can speak to our database, and we're exposing certain parts of our server through the APIs that we're building so that clients can be able to work with our server and with our database. Now, the client can be a number of things. It could be a browser, which is trying to load up a web page, in which case it will make a GET request to our server via our API, and our server will send over the relevant HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files to be able to render that web page in the browser. But our client, say a browser, could also be making GET requests that is looking for a particular resource, say some data or a file. And in the last lesson, we've seen that we can simply make that request to our API by going to that /articles route. And when we hit enter, this makes a GET request on that route. And we'll get sent back the data that we requested in a JSON format. Now, that's all very well and good for GET requests, but how do we do that using POST requests? Well, here comes a handy tool called Postman.
Oh yes, wait a minute, Mr. Postman.
And this is what's going to enable us to send data and test our API without having to worry about building an HTML form or building up the front end at all. So let's go ahead and first install Postman. So if you head over to getpostman.com, then you can go ahead and click to download the app, choose your platform to download, and go ahead and install that. Now, the first time you open Postman, you should get a welcome window like this. And this has a number of common things that you might want to do or create, but we're actually going to close this window and we don't want it to launch every single time. So now here's our workspace inside Postman, and our goal is to be able to make a post request to our server. But before we can do that, we first have to code it up so our server can actually make the correct response. So in order to use Express to address post requests on our server, we use the app.post method, and then we specify the route and we have a callback. You've seen this before whenever we've used our server to handle post requests coming from a form. So inside here, let's do that for real. Let's do app.post. And then we're going to specify the route, which is exactly the same as before, because RESTful conventions dictate that the post request should go to the collection of resources rather than a specific resource. So if you had a whole bunch of articles, it should go to /articles rather than a specific article. So let's go ahead and add that /articles. And then we're going to add our callback, request, and response. So once the post request comes through from the client, we're going to need to tap into the request.body in order to grab some of the data that was sent through. And here, if you remember from previous lessons, when we created HTML forms, we were able to tap into a variable name that we gave to each of the fields in the form by accessing the name attribute. So in our case, we're going to have a field probably for title and another one for the content. So the names of our variables are title and content. And if we had a form associated with this post request, the name attribute of one input might be title and the name attribute of the other one might be content. Now, for now, because we want to test this, let's go ahead and log this request.body.title and also log the request.body.content so that we can see when the request gets passed by body parser and we tap into a variable called title and a variable called content, we can actually confirm that the post request is working and that we can see the data that's being sent through. So now we're ready to go into Postman and create a new request. So in this console here, we're going to create our new request. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to change that HTTP request from get to post. And then we're going to add the request URL, which is going to be localhost 3000. And then we're going to specify the route where our post request is handled, which is going to be /articles. And I'm just going to copy and paste that in there. So this should now read localhost 3000 /articles. And then we're going to send some data along with this post request. There's no other reason for making post requests, right? So now if you go over to this body tab and change the encoding to form URL encoded, which is what our body parser is designed to handle, then we can add in those variable names that we defined here, title and content, as the keys for our data. So one is going to be title and the other one is going to be content. And then the value is the data that we're going to send over along with our post. Now, let's say that I wanted to create a new article on Jack Bauer. So my title might be Jack Bauer, and the content I'm going to copy from a website that has amused me for a long time anyways, which is the top 100 facts about Jack Bauer. And the one that ranks the most highly, and the first one says, Jack Bauer once stepped into quicksand. The quicksand couldn't escape and nearly drowned. So let's go ahead and copy this and paste it into Postman as the value for our content key. So now these values are the ones that we should now be able to tap into through request.body.title and request.body.content. And when that post request gets triggered, then it gets handled inside here and we should be able to log the things that we sent over and we should be able to see it inside our console over here. So let's just make sure that our app.js has been saved and that our server has restarted and it's running on port 3000. Now let's head into Postman and click on send to make that request. And now if we check inside our hyperterminal, you can see that it's logged the values of both of those things that we sent over, the title and the content. So now that we've confirmed that we can make requests through Postman, we can go ahead and add the rest of the code, which saves this into our MongoDB. And just a quick reminder, in order to create data inside our MongoDB database using Mongoose, we've seen this before, but just a quick reminder, we create a new constant that's going to store a new article. And then the article will have two fields, title and content, and we're going to set the data for that based on the data that we received through the post request. And then finally, we're going to save that new object into our database. So let's do it for real now. Let's create a constant that's going to be called new article. And this is going to be created using the new keyword and the article model, which we created up here. And then we're going to open a set of round brackets or parentheses and then some curly braces and hit enter. Now inside here, we have to define the data that we want to create for our two fields, title and content. Now title is going to store the data that we received through the post request through request.body.title. So I'm just going to cut that and paste it in here. And then content is going to store the data that comes over through the post request through request.body.content. And make sure you have a comma that separates the two fields. Now let's close that off using a semicolon and we're ready to save our new article. So we're going to call new article.save. So now let's hit save so that our app.js has saved, and then our server has restarted, and we can go back into Postman and we can go ahead and click send to make the exact same post request to the same route using the same content that we had before. But this time, the only difference is that instead of console logging it inside the console, it should be able to add it into our MongoDB database, and we should be able to see it when we refresh our collections in Robo3T. So let's go ahead and click send. And now if we go into Robo3T and we refresh our articles collection by clicking on view documents, you can see we now have an extra entry. And entry number 5 has the title of Jack Bauer and the content that Jack Bauer once stepped into quicksand and the quicksand couldn't escape. That is a very, very quick way of setting this up. Now, there's just one thing that you might notice. Here, our request is expecting something to come back, right? Like that was successful or it wasn't successful. So in our server, we should be sending something back just as we did over here. If there were errors, we'll send the error. If there weren't any errors, we'll just send that everything was A-okay. And inside our save method, we can actually add a callback function that will trigger if there were any errors. Now, how do I know that we could do this? Well, documentation. Reading through the documentation can make you an expert in any framework or module. So you can see over here in the models part of the documentation, it says that when we construct documents, for example, when we run something.save, we can actually add a callback and we'll receive any errors if that actually happened. So inside here, if there were no errors, then that is when we're going to res.send successfully added a new article. But if there were some errors, so else, we're just going to res.send the error that we got back from Mongoose. So now our post request is complete. Our post request targets the articles route and it creates a new article using the data that was submitted through the post request, and then we save that new article. If there were errors, then we send an error back to the client. If there weren't any errors, then we tell the client that everything went swimmingly. So now we have addressed what should happen when a client makes a post request and sends over some data to our server via our API, targeting the articles route.